What if I told you the next revolution in electric vehicles didn't roar out of Silicon Valley, or glide out of a German engineering lab, or hum from the neon factories of China, but instead rose from the red earth of a West African nation that the world had long ignored? What if I told you that a country with no sprawling auto plants, no deep financial reservoirs, no legacy of mass production, just launched an electric car that could make the giants of the industry sweat? And what if this wasn't just about a vehicle, it was about a signal? A warning flare fired high into the global sky, one that says, Africa is not waiting anymore. Burkina Faso, a name barely whispered in the boardrooms of Detroit, Berlin, or Beijing, has done what wealthier, more established nations have only dared to dream. It has built its own fully homegrown electric vehicle. Not a remixed import, not a project powered by foreign money. A vehicle imagined, engineered, and crafted by the minds and hands of its own people. And it's not just another newsflash to be forgotten by morning. It's a declaration, a statement, a seismic shift, a line drawn in the sand between the world that was and the world that's coming. Africa is not content to be the world's dumping ground, a passive marketplace for Western and Asian products. Africa is not resigned to wait for hand-me-down innovations or second-hand dreams. This isn't charity, it's not luck, it's will, it's brilliance, it's resilience. And it's happening right now, whether the world is ready or not. You see, for decades, when the conversation turned to electric vehicles, the future of transportation, the same names always floated to the top. Tesla, Volkswagen, BYD, NIO. Titans with empires behind them. No one ever glanced at Africa, and certainly not at Burkina Faso. The assumption was cruelly simple. Africa was too late, too poor, too disconnected from the brutal race of industrialization to ever catch up. Africa, they said, would always be a customer, never a creator. They were wrong, because today Burkina Faso isn't asking for a seat at the table. They're building their own table. In a world that talks endlessly about innovation, about disruption, about courage, Burkina Faso dared to believe that it didn't need permission to create. It dared to dream, yes, but more importantly, it dared to build. Against every odd, against every dismissive headline, against every whisper that said, you can't. But how? How did a country with no established car industry, no deep-pocketed backers, no long pipeline of engineers and suppliers manage to do what no one expected? How did they leapfrog the barriers that have kept entire continents silent in the global tech conversation? And perhaps more urgently, is this a one-time miracle, or the opening salvo of something much bigger, something that could transform the entire African continent and rattle the very foundations of global industry? This isn't just about a car. It's about self-reliance, turning from a dream into a blueprint. It's about shattering the myth that innovation belongs only to the privileged few. It's about Africa taking control of its own narrative and, in doing so, shaking the pillars of a world order built to keep it waiting. So buckle up. Because what happened in Burkina Faso isn't a fluke. It's a movement that's already rippling across borders, across industries, and across the minds of a generation that refuses to be overlooked any longer. And as we peel back the layers of this story, one thing becomes clear. The world wasn't watching Africa. But from this day forward, it won't be able to look away. 5 years ago, if you had asked the leading automotive experts in Europe, America, or Asia whether Burkina Faso, one of the smallest, often forgotten nations in West Africa, could produce a fully homegrown electric vehicle, you would have been met with polite chuckles or outright laughter. Not out of malice, but because it simply seemed impossible. The country had no major car manufacturing history. No sprawling assembly plants humming with machinery. No multinational corporations pouring billions into infrastructure. By every conventional metric, Burkina Faso wasn't even supposed to be part of the conversation. It wasn't a contender. It wasn't even on the radar. Meanwhile, nations like South Africa and Morocco, with their established foreign-backed auto industries, seemed the obvious favorites. South Africa boasted major production facilities run by European and Asian giants. Morocco was celebrated as a rising manufacturing hub, shipping vehicles and parts across the Mediterranean. These countries had the investment, the international partnerships, the roads paved by decades of industrial development. And yet, in all that time, neither had birthed a fully indigenous, locally designed electric vehicle. Not one. And that's precisely where Burkina Faso's story breaks every rule in the book. Because while the world's eyes were focused elsewhere, on Silicon Valley breakthroughs, on German engineering marvels, on Chinese battery innovations, a tiny group of visionaries in Ouagadougou quietly rolled up their sleeves and began building the impossible from scratch. Their name? Itaway, a startup barely known even within their own country. A small, scrappy team of engineers, entrepreneurs, and dreamers who refused to sit idle, refused to wait for foreign investors, refused to be told to know their place. Where others waited for aid, they picked up tools. Where others looked for permission, they charted their own course. The strategy was nothing short of genius, because it was born out of necessity. First, Itaway understood that copying Western models wholesale would never work. Burkina Faso didn't have the luxury of endless subsidies, billion-dollar venture funds, or easy access to massive supply chains. So, instead of chasing the impossible, they focused on what was essential, and more importantly, what was possible. They sourced locally, wherever possible. Rather than depending on expensive imported materials, they leaned into Africa's own resources. Metals, composites, simple yet durable parts, drawn from neighboring countries crafted with local hands. In doing so, they not only slashed costs, but also created a model of production rooted in self-reliance, one that strengthened regional ties instead of perpetuating foreign dependence. They built batteries suited for African realities, the typical electric vehicle battery, designed for the cool climates of Europe, the temperate zones of North America, the urban jungles of China, suffers under the brutal, relentless heat of the West African sun. So the Itaway team didn't just adapt, they innovated. They engineered battery systems resilient to high temperatures, able to endure rough terrain, fluctuating power supplies, and long distances without faltering. In a market where a dead battery in the middle of nowhere can mean life or death, this was not a bonus feature. It was survival. They skipped the foreign assembly lines altogether. Most developing countries' manufacturing industries are really just assembly centers for parts designed and made elsewhere. Burkina Faso rejected that model. Every major system in the car, from the chassis to the drivetrain to the battery pack, was designed, tested, and assembled by local engineers. It wasn't about nationalism. It was about control, about ownership, about building the kind of foundational knowledge that cannot be outsourced, cannot be taken away. While the world doubted, they were busy building. And when the veil was finally lifted, when the first locally produced electric vehicle rolled out, under the West African sun, it didn't just look impressive. It performed impressively. A 30-minute fast-charging system rivaling Tesla's own supercharger technology. Efficient, rugged, and affordable. The vehicle wasn't a flashy showpiece, meant for auto shows and press conferences. It was built to work, to survive, to endure Africa's unforgiving roads and climates. It was, quite simply, built for reality, not luxury. The global auto industry, so comfortable in its assumptions, never saw it coming. They believed that innovation was something that could only bloom in the sterile laboratories of the West or the hyper-industrialized cities of the East. They forgot, or maybe never knew, that necessity breeds innovation, and that there is no greater forge for creativity than being forced to make something out of nothing. This was undercover genius in its purest form. No press releases, no splashy marketing campaigns, just a team of locals, studying, experimenting, failing, trying again, and eventually succeeding. Their knowledge of the terrain, of the people's needs, of the harsh environmental conditions, became their unfair advantage. While Tesla's sleek models might glide over manicured Californian streets, Itaway's vehicle was made to thunder over pothole-riddled highways, to brave sandstorms, to endure temperature swings that would cripple lesser machines. In the battle of innovation, the environment is the invisible hand that chooses winners. And Itaway understood their environment better than any foreign consultant ever could. They didn't build a car to impress Silicon Valley investors. They built a car to serve the people who would actually drive it. Think about that, because that's where so many established companies fail, building for headlines instead of humans. Burkina Faso's EV wasn't trying to be the next status symbol parked outside a luxury high-rise. It was trying to survive in villages without paved roads, in cities where a full charging station might be 100 kilometers apart, in climates that don't show mercy. In a world obsessed with luxury, they built for longevity. In a world chasing trends, they engineered for necessity, and that's why their success isn't a fluke. It's the beginning of a shift, a dangerous one for the complacent giants who believed their dominance was eternal. But here's the real twist, the one the world is only now beginning to understand. Building a car is one thing. Taking on the giants who rule the global auto industry, that's another war altogether, because Itaway's quiet revolution in Burkina Faso didn't just build a vehicle, it built a challenge. A challenge to Tesla's monopoly of the electric imagination. A challenge to Europe's comfortable assumption that Africa will always be 10 steps behind. A challenge to the idea that industrial miracles only happen where skyscrapers scrape the sky. The real battle hasn't even begun yet, because it's not just about one car, it's about a philosophy, a model, a proof that somewhere far from Wall Street or Frankfurt or Shanghai, the engines of change are roaring to life. And those engines are African. They're local. They're unstoppable. The silent architects of this revolution didn't just craft a machine, they crafted a movement. And now, the question hanging over the heads of every automaker in the world is no longer if Burkina Faso can build. It's what else can they build next? The stakes have changed. The game is on, and the next move could change the future forever. Tesla wasn't watching. The Goliath of the electric vehicle world, the golden child of Silicon Valley, the symbol of innovation itself, had its eyes set on the usual suspects. They were busy tracking competition from Germany, where Volkswagen was pouring billions into EVs. They were wargaming against China's BYD, watching nervously as Chinese engineers shaved off months from production cycles. They were measuring threats by traditional standards, the size of factories, the thickness of balance sheets, the reach of brand power. They never saw Burkina Faso coming, because in Tesla's world, the high towers, the glossy shareholder meetings, the futuristic promises broadcast from polished stages, Africa was still just a market. A distant afterthought. A place where used cars were dumped, not where competitors were born. Africa wasn't supposed to build the future, it was supposed to buy it. But something was stirring far beyond the reach of Tesla's satellites and spreadsheets, and by the time they noticed, it was already too late. Here's the brutal truth Tesla missed. While the giants were focused on refining luxuries, self-driving features, voice-activated apps, AI integrations, Burkina Faso was refining survival, while Tesla was sinking billions into expanding its global supply chain, leaning heavily on Chinese battery technology. Burkina Faso was breaking free from middlemen altogether. Tesla is still dependent. Even today, the vast majority of Tesla's battery components come from sprawling Chinese operations. Even Tesla's raw materials, lithium, cobalt, are mined largely in Africa, then shipped across oceans to be processed elsewhere, only to be sold back at a massive markup. Burkina Faso, on the other hand, flipped the script. Rather than exporting their resources for others to profit, they decided to build in-house. They developed their own battery technology, sourced materials regionally, and engineered systems specifically adapted to their climate and infrastructure. No detours, no dependency, no middlemen. They weren't just building cars. They were reclaiming power. And power, once reclaimed, is contagious. The implications of this terrified boardrooms from Palo Alto to Berlin, because if Burkina Faso could do it, who's next? If a nation with no previous auto industry could design, build, and roll out a fully indigenous EV, what excuse did larger nations have? What if Africa no longer needed Tesla? What if it no longer needed anyone? The parallels are undeniable. Just a few decades ago, Western executives laughed at the idea of China as a technological superpower. In the 1980s, made in China was synonymous with cheap knockoffs and low-quality manufacturing. No one feared Chinese car brands. No one imagined Chinese smartphones replacing iPhones. Then, almost without warning, China moved. Through relentless local innovation, massive investment, and a steely focus on self-reliance, China didn't just catch up, it overtook. Today, Chinese EVs dominate global markets. Today, companies like BYD are racing past their Western counterparts, not in dreams, but in real-world sales, infrastructure, and influence. Africa is stepping into that history now, and Burkina Faso just fired the first shot. Inside Tesla's walls, disbelief turned to slow horror. An African-built EV, cheaper than anything Tesla could offer? Tougher? Built for roads Tesla's luxury sedans couldn't even survive? Tailored for real-world African conditions, where potholes swallow tires, where heat cripples batteries, where infrastructure is an unpredictable gamble. Impossible, they said. Impossible. Until it wasn't. For years, skeptics scoffed at the idea of Africa entering the EV game. They don't have the infrastructure. They don't have the expertise. They'll just import whatever China or Europe builds, but skeptics measure only what they can see. They measure only traditional markers of success: highways, skyscrapers, stock market tickers. They didn't measure hunger. They didn't measure resilience. They didn't measure the power of building something, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Durability versus luxury. Tesla's vehicles are feats of engineering, on paper, but they were never designed for Africa's rugged backroads, or the bone-dry dust, or the unpredictable weather. Their sleek suspensions and lightweight frames falter on terrain where a simple dirt road can turn into a battlefield. Burkina Faso's EV, it was made to last. The suspension wasn't just optimized, it was armored. The battery wasn't just efficient, it was heat-resistant, built to laugh in the face of 40 degrees Celsius. Then the body wasn't designed for showroom beauty. It was built for battlefield durability, affordability versus prestige. Tesla's cheapest models remain unattainable for the average African citizen. Even imported Chinese EVs, shipped at enormous cost, slapped with import taxes, remain toys for the elite. But Burkina Faso's car, produced locally, built from local resources, designed with cost control in mind, has the power to be different. No massive import fees, no bloated foreign labor costs, no dependency on distant supply chains that jack up prices. The potential is simple and revolutionary: an EV for Africa, by Africa, priced for Africa. Accessibility versus exclusivity. The promise of Tesla's global revolution was noble, but in practice, it's remained an exclusive club. Charging stations spaced across rich suburbs, service centers in wealthy enclaves, vehicles priced out of reach for billions. It's a revolution for the few. Burkina Faso's approach was brutally pragmatic. If you want mass adoption, you don't need a better autopilot. You need a car that can charge in half an hour under a solar array in the middle of a village. You need a vehicle that can survive rough terrain without needing a $10,000 service job. You need an EV that doesn't aspire to luxury. It aspires to liberation. And while the world hesitated, Burkina Faso moved. While experts debated, they engineered. While investors doubted, they built. While the giants guarded their castles, Burkina Faso forged new roads where no one was looking. Now the tremors are being felt in places that once laughed. In Tesla's war rooms, strategists are scrambling. In European factories, alarm bells are ringing. In Chinese supply chains, quiet recalculations are happening behind closed doors. Because the threat isn't just one car. It's a model of self-reliance that threatens to upend the entire balance of power. Africa's strength has always been buried under centuries of exploitation, underestimated potential, and systemic dismissal. Burkina Faso's EV is not just a product. It's a proof point. Proof that Africa can design, proof that Africa can manufacture, proof that Africa can lead. And now, the floodgates are opening. Burkina Faso's success is inspiring waves of ambition across the continent. Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa. Nations that once flirted with EV dreams are now considering full-scale industrial revolutions. The dam of doubt has cracked, the tide is turning, and the ones who laughed the loudest, they will be the ones scrambling the hardest to catch up. Because history has a cruel memory. When you ignore the underdog long enough, you forget to protect your blind spots, and by the time you realize the threat isn't coming from where you expected, it's already inside your gates. Tesla's blind spot wasn't a lack of technology, it wasn't a lack of money, it was a lack of imagination. They couldn't imagine that the next great innovation wouldn't come from a glittering metropolis, but from a dusty street in Ouagadougou. They couldn't imagine that the greatest threat to their empire would be built by people who weren't supposed to be part of the conversation. They couldn't imagine that Africa, so long treated as a consumer, would dare to become a creator. But imagination, like innovation, can no longer be a luxury reserved for the West. The age of African silence is ending. The age of African industry is beginning. And the smartest players in the game, they're no longer asking, can they? They're asking, how fast will they move next? The underdog has risen. The giants are blinking in disbelief. And the future, it's racing toward them. The spark that ignited in Burkina Faso is no longer just a local fire. It is spreading, invisible yet unstoppable, carried by the winds of ambition across a continent long underestimated, long overshadowed. In Nairobi, in Lagos, in Johannesburg, the whispers have started. Whispers of possibility, whispers that sound dangerously like a revolution. Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, nations once resigned to importing foreign innovation, are now paying attention, closely. If Burkina Faso, a country with fewer resources, fewer factories, and fewer allies, could build a competitive electric car from scratch, what excuse did they have? If Burkina Faso could leapfrog the traditional industrialization playbook, why couldn't they? The ripples are turning into waves. Africa is no longer content to be the world's afterthought, the marketplace where second-hand goods and surplus technologies are dumped. The story is changing. Africa is not just a consumer anymore. Africa is becoming a producer, and with production comes transformation. The economic dominoes are starting to fall. First, job creation. In countries where youth unemployment rates hover dangerously high, the promise of a homegrown electric vehicle industry is not just about pride. It's about livelihoods. Every new factory, every battery workshop, every charging station project means thousands of jobs, not just for engineers, but for technicians, logistics workers, designers, electricians, and supply chain managers. Jobs that do not require asking foreign companies for favors. Jobs that are built by Africans for Africans. Second, retaining billions inside local economies. Every year, African nations bleed wealth by importing vehicles from Europe, Asia, and the United States, most of them second-hand, most of them draining. Capital that could have been used to build infrastructure, schools, hospitals. Imagine reversing that flow. Imagine billions of dollars no longer being siphoned out of Africa, but instead recycled within, fueling further growth, investment, and empowerment. This is not a small shift. It is a complete rewiring of economic destiny. Third, building Pan-African. Supply chains. Burkina Faso's breakthrough is just the first domino. Once other nations follow, Nigeria harnessing its vast industrial base, Kenya leveraging its tech ecosystem, South Africa scaling its manufacturing strength, a web of interlinked African industries can emerge. Raw materials mined in the Congo could power batteries assembled in Ghana, which could drive vehicles manufactured in Senegal, all sold to consumers from Ethiopia to Ivory Coast. Not dependency on Europe, not dependency on China, but an African network of production, trade, and innovation, stronger together than apart. And then there's the solar energy opportunity. While the West debates how to transition away from fossil fuels, Africa holds an ace the world can only envy: sunlight. Endless, abundant, reliable solar energy. The same sun that scorches the plains of Burkina Faso, the deserts of Namibia, and the savannas of Kenya could be the engine of an electric future. Imagine a continent where electric vehicles aren't charged from aging coal plants or unstable grids, but directly from solar farms sprouting like wildflowers across the land. Charging stations powered by pure, clean sunlight. Off-grid, self-sufficient, resilient. While the West struggles with retrofitting old infrastructure, Africa has the chance to leapfrog, to build an energy ecosystem born for the future, not trapped by the past. Solar-charged EVs roaming across highways not yet clogged by combustion engines. Entire cities designed around clean mobility from the ground up. The opportunity isn't just environmental, it's strategic, it's transformational. 4. The first time in living memory, African hands are not just building futures. They're designing them. This isn't about copying the West's path. This is about forging a new one. And that shift isn't just happening in factories and fields. It's happening deep inside the hearts and minds of a generation who grew up believing that the best products, the best ideas, the best futures were made elsewhere. A psychological revolution is taking root. Local pride is rising. Young people who once idolized foreign brands are now looking with wonder and pride at vehicles made by their own engineers, on their own soil. They are seeing proof that brilliance does not require an American address or a European passport. It requires only belief and boldness. Inferiority complexes are crumbling. For too long, a hidden corrosive lie festered inside African economies. That imported meant better, that local meant less. Burkina Faso's electric car is smashing that lie with the force of a sledgehammer. It says, with roaring defiance, we are not less, we are not late, we are leaders. Belief in African-made technology is blooming. Once, a Made in Africa label was an apology. Now it is becoming a badge of honor, a symbol of resilience, a symbol of what happens when creativity meets necessity, when ambition collides with opportunity. From the dusty back streets of Ouagadougou to the glass towers rising over Lagos, a new engine is starting to hum. Silent at first, almost imperceptible to those still stuck in the old world's view of Africa. But make no mistake, the hum is growing louder. It is the sound of factories awakening. It is the sound of entrepreneurs dreaming bigger. It is the sound of a continent, for the first time in centuries, designing its own destiny. And it's not stopping. From Ouagadougou's innovation centers to the bustling markets of Nairobi, from the assembly lines of Johannesburg to the electric startups of Accra, a wave is building, a wave that doesn't beg for recognition, but demands it. Africa's hidden engines have always been there, the ingenuity, the determination, the brilliance. They were buried under generations of exploitation, overlooked by a world too blind to see potential unless it came packaged with billion-dollar logos. Now, those engines are roaring back to life. Not quietly, not cautiously, but with the full force of a people who are no longer waiting for permission to dream, and certainly not waiting for permission to build, because once a continent rediscovers its power, it doesn't go back to sleep. Once a generation sees what it can create, it doesn't settle for less ever again. And as the dust rises in the African sun, as solar panels glint across forgotten fields, as electric motors whir to life in places the world forgot, one truth becomes impossible to deny. The future of innovation is no longer something Africa will buy. It's something Africa will sell, and the world better be ready. Burkina Faso didn't just build a car, they built a declaration, a bold, irreversible statement to the world. Africa leads now. In a single revolutionary move, they shattered the old expectations. They ripped apart the tired narratives that confined Africa to being a consumer of global technology, never a creator. They proved that innovation doesn't need the approval of Wall Street, the blessing of Silicon Valley, or the investments of European conglomerates to flourish. They showed that when the world wasn't looking, Africa was quietly preparing to rise, not as a follower, but as a fierce competitor. And now, that quiet preparation is over. The engine has roared to life. The wheels are turning. The race has begun. For those still clinging to the old world views, here's a truth that can no longer be ignored. The next Tesla won't come from Palo Alto. It'll rise from the heart of Africa. It won't be born from billion-dollar tech parks lined with glass towers. It will be forged in the workshops of Ouagadougou, in the solar fields of Namibia, in the innovation hubs of Lagos. It will be shaped by engineers who understand their environment, who design not for luxury, but for life, who build not for Wall Street, but for real streets, the ones that connect villages, the ones that cut across deserts and jungles and cities blooming under African suns. But make no mistake, the real battle is only beginning. The world's established powers are watching now. Tesla's analysts are scrambling, governments are whispering. Behind closed doors, venture capitalists are recalculating their maps of opportunity and threat. Because if Burkina Faso's first vehicle can challenge the industry's assumptions, what happens when they move to scale? Can Burkina Faso master mass production and flood the market with affordable EVs? Will Tesla retaliate, pushing harder into African markets, leveraging its wealth and influence to hold ground? Will the West finally respect African innovation, or try to buy it, control it, bury it once again? The answers to these questions will determine not just the future of electric vehicles, but the future of industrial power itself. And this is just the beginning. In the next chapter, we'll dive deeper into a hidden story the world still doesn't fully understand. How Africa's vast, untapped reserves of battery minerals, lithium, cobalt, nickel, are about to rewrite the rules of the global tech war. We'll explore how control over these resources could catapult African nations to the forefront of a new economic era, or ignite a battle for ownership more fierce than anything the continent has seen in generations. So if you believe in a world where underdogs win, where the overlooked rise, where history is written not by those with the most money, but by those with the most courage, stay tuned. Because history isn't just happening somewhere far away. It's happening right here, right now, and you're watching it unfold. Africa's engines are awakening. The race is on, and what happens next could change everything you thought you knew about Africa, about innovation, and about power.